All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior at Harvard. I study history, literature, and global health and health policy. I'm also the lead coordinator of this winter session program. I'm interested in global health and foreign aid because it is central to my career interests. I grew up in 5 countries, including Nepal. So that's the reason it's not on my list. And I'm inspired by my parents' work in international development. So the goals of this session are to explore some of the nuances of the global health and development cause area at large using foreign aid as an entry point. I'm going to use foreign aid and development assistance interchangeably in this presentation, not only because development assistance is more politically correct, but also because it's more accurate. When you invest in the well-being of people around the world, everyone benefits. So I think assistance is a good way to go about it. I'd also like to introduce some new considerations that aren't necessarily built into EA frameworks. We care a lot about scale and cost effectiveness, but there's much less discussion of whether beneficiaries have any agency in what's going on, whether your programs are being sustainable, and the kinds of chain reactions, how we can measure impact beyond how many vaccines get distributed. And then last, I'm going to introduce 6 different case studies so that we can apply some of these frameworks to real world issues. So I'd like to start off with a survey/quiz. I'm going to put the link in the chat. There are 0 stakes. Uh-oh. How do I make this bigger? I'm going to stop screen sharing and put it in the chat. You guys are the best. So once you enter this quiz, there are no stakes, nobody's gonna win, but I'd like to use it as kind of a demonstration of what the public thinks about the state of the world. So, and I'm also going to screen share so that you can see everyone's thinking as the answers roll in. So, how's the world doing? Let's go to question 1. I hope everybody is in, and if we hit 15, I'm gonna have to do a little thing. Okay, let's begin. So question 1, again, no pressure. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the global population living in extreme poverty has almost doubled, remained more or less the same, or almost halved. There should be a blue submit button if you've entered. Please unmute yourself and let me know if the survey isn't working. I'm not seeing anything come in.
I submitted it. It just says let's wait and see now.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Wait, mine didn't have a submit button.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Yeah, mine doesn't have it as submit button.
Can I put my vote in the chat or?
Yes, I won't be able to see the chat, but please feel free to. So that's wonderful. You guys are totally right. Poverty has almost halved in the last 20 years. Next question. It's a lot of wait time here. On average, what percentage of girls finish primary school in low-income countries? 20%, 40%, or 60%? So low-income countries are also developing countries, in other words. Right, I'm assuming the answers are in. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Would you guys please do that again? I'm very new to this platform. It's the same question. Could also pause and make it a 30-second thing. Gorgeous. Uh-oh, a little pessimistic here. The answer is, in fact, 60% of girls finish primary schools in low-income countries. Today, what percentage of the world's 1-year-old children have been vaccinated against some disease? Any disease at all? 20%, 50%, or 80%? Waiting on one more person, it looks like. Great, you guys are the best. Hey, okay, we're picking up on the pattern here. It turns out that 80% of children around the world have been vaccinated against some disease. Question 4. What percentage of people in the world today have access to electricity? 20%, 50%, or 80%? Here we go, 80%. Isn't that thrilling? I think that's thrilling. Okay, all done. Of course, there are massive disparities. We'll talk about that later. But last question, looking to the future now. The UN predicts that by 2100, the world population will have increased by another 4 billion people. What is the main reason? What is the age demographic that's going to increase the population by this much? Is it children under 15, more adults, or more elderly people that are driving this massive population increase? This is just a fun fact. This isn't about EA. I just like this. There is an insane population bulge. The idea is that right now, wealth is correlated directly with how many children you have, right? The more wealthy you are, the fewer children you have. And so if poverty reduces, people will immediately stop having children and everyone's going to be an adult by 2100. That's the demographic thinking behind that. Anyway, thank you so much for participating in that. Let me get back to screen sharing. So in general, people tend to answer these questions pretty pessimistically. People don't think that the world is doing so great or improving very quickly. And these stats were based on the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling, 10 Reasons Why We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. This was on Bill Gates' reading list a couple of years ago. So at one point, Hans Rosling gave a TED talk and asked, for example, that vaccination question. And 17% of the US American audiences believed that it was the worst answer. 20% of the US media believed it was the worst answer. 8% of the Swedish public, his home nation, his nationality, thought it was the worst, and 6% of the EU media. So the EU media was the most accurate and the US media was the worst. Anyway, there are immense benefits to having people be pessimistic about the state of the world. People will be more likely to donate if they believe everything is a catastrophe. They might be more responsible in their own conduct if they believe catastrophes are imminent, and they'll be more likely to invest in research and different kinds of interventions. But the problem, of course, is that, as Hans Rosling says, instead of embracing a worldview based on facts, we can lose our ability to focus on the right things or the accurate things that threaten us most. And in this book, highly recommend, he outlines a bunch of biases. So for example, the fear instinct. People are hardwired to pay more attention to frightening things, which is, of course, fed by the media. There's a size instinct that distorts people's perception of the world. It's our tendency to get things out of proportion or misjudge the size of things. In EA, we talk a lot about scope and sensitivity. People have a very, very poor understanding of the difference, for example, between 100,000 and 1 million things. At some point, people just lose track of scale. So, if someone says 1 million children are dying of this specific thing, you might interpret that as like 5 million. So that makes it easy to be pessimistic about the state of the world. Generalization, our tendency to mistakenly group things together for people or countries that are actually very different. This is a relevant issue in EA because we take randomized control trials very seriously. So if, for example, you went into a village and installed a tube well and it worked wonderfully, EA would say everyone needs a tube well exactly like this. So In addition to making us pessimistic, it's an important consideration for effective altruists. And finally, the gap instinct. It's our tendency to divide things into two distinct and often conflicting groups with an imagined gap between them. The most common of those gaps is us versus them, which we do speak about in EA in terms of tribalism or ethnocentricity in what we donate to. You know, were people more likely to donate to 9/11, reconstruction, and donations, as opposed to many more people dying in ongoing conflicts overseas? So there is a ton of work to be done, despite how exciting it is. It's important to account for all the things that are going to get more difficult, more complicated, more nuanced, more intersectional in the future. The climate crisis naturally wasn't accounted for in any of those optimistic notes. COVID-19 has also set back poverty reduction rates over time. So all of the improvement that we've been doing on poverty has been consistently effective for 20 years. And with COVID-19, this is the first year that poverty is going to increase. So, and of course, millions of people are going to die from famines because of COVID. So there's a real wrench in the machinery. And then disparities. So I'm going to show you now a series of maps based on different kinds of development indicators. I hope that in looking at these, you consider how these different kinds of indicators might be connected. For example, I will show you literacy rates. How might literacy rates that are low in certain areas affect the GDP of the countries they live in? So here's GDP per capita. There's absolute poverty. Life expectancy. So purple is ideal. Some of the people calling in have pretty good life expectancies. Under 5 mortality. These are often due to dehydration and infectious disease because their immune systems are so low. Literacy rates. Urbanization, the proportion of people living in cities as opposed to farms or suburbs. Interpartner violence against women, also known as domestic abuse. Food deficits. Perceptions of corruption. We're not doing so well there. And the General Human Rights Index, which accounts for many of these other factors. So, following up on those maps, let's take a look at where the US is currently distributing the most foreign aid. There's clearly some overlap with some of the maps we saw, specifically in, sub-Saharan Africa, and some parts of Latin America, but some of the regions that are in particularly early stages of development, countries that scored really poorly on all of those indexes, are being left behind, especially if we look to, for example, regions of Central Asia or Southern America. Another question we should be asking whenever looking critically at foreign aid models like these, I haven't said yet, this is USAID, the main global development branch foreign aid source for the US government. Apologies. Where is the money going? How is it getting to these countries? And as you can see on the chart on the right that corresponds to this map on the left, it's not, I was incredibly surprised. It might seem surprising to all of you too, the fact that the vast majority of the money, at least in comparison to other types of aid, is going to peacekeeping and, making sure that voting is effective, emergency response. There's not a lot of climate change going on, despite the crisis that's coming. We think a lot about America and the WFP, and as we'll see later, the US donates an immense amount of money to the WFP. But, what are we investing in when we invest in these countries is an important question to ask. So how does EA approach global development in terms of the international health and development cause area? Very favorably. Some of the quotes from 80,000 Hours and the Congressional Research Service say the problem of global poverty is large in scale, hundreds of millions of people are suffering, and given its scale, it's relatively neglected. You might recognize that language from the animal welfare cause area. Because so many billions of animals are dying, it's going to be relatively neglected. It's also highly tractable because we know with certainty of ways to treat and prevent different kinds of infectious diseases, for example, and we have really strong evidence. So EA loves it. There are lots of other philosophical ways to approach it. We've got EA in the left column here. It's neglected, evidence-based, good for the long-term future. There's also, of course, the utilitarian argument that if you globalize, connect with these countries, make them stronger, better trade partners, more stable, it'll protect your security as a nation if there are fewer wars, for example. It could also be considered compensatory justice. It's reparations for colonialization, different countries' unwillingness to intervene in genocides, for example. Counter-argument to the compensatory justice approach, though, is the state of nature argument, that the global poor would have been no worse off if we hadn't done anything. Interesting to account for. I strongly disagree, but it's on there. And then also the argument that we have a moral obligation to invest in development assistance. So if you are able to help people, you should. This is a serious point of enthusiasm for Peter Singer. He took, for example, he referenced 9/11 donation patterns. He said my apologies. Here's an example that he gave. In the year 2000, Americans made private donations for foreign aid of all kinds, totaling about $4 per person in extreme poverty, or roughly $20 per family. New Yorkers who were living in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, 2001, whether wealthy or not, were able to receive an average of $5,300 per family. So when we think about whether you're able to help, if we were able to mobilize those kinds of donations in the wake of 9/11, why can't we do it every year? We have an obligation to do it every year, Peter Singer would say. Of course, counters, why can't they fix their own country? Another counter is that it's not a moral obligation, it's enlightened self-interest, because based on the utilitarian argument, we're going to benefit. So murky morally. Just briefly going to define development assistance. I realize it's late in the presentation, but I should just do it formally. Any tangible or intangible item, according to the Congressional Research Service, provided by a government to a foreign country or international organization. These usually take the form of infrastructure, like buildings or weapons, healthcare, like x-rays and vaccines, direct cash transfers, like with loans or grants, institutional support, like law enforcement training, and tangible support, naturally, like food for refugees. As of 2020, the US spends less than 1% of its GDP or annual revenue on foreign aid. And remarkably, Americans on average believe that this number is 25% of the GDP that we're donating overseas. And when asked how much it should be, they said about 10%. Given that this is such a low proportion, the US is actually dead last in rankings among high-income countries' donations in proportion to their income. So in thinking about, I forgot to say, and there are lots of different ways in which foreign aid is distributed. It can be bilateral, which is government to government, multilateral, like donating to a third party like the UN, and non-government, so a government just donating to a nonprofit. These are the main ways. And this is how much the United States, donates to these kinds of models. So here are two examples of multilateral models of development assistance. On the left, we have the UN, which gets 74% of its funding from national governments. Membership fees are a reality for the 190 plus member states of the UN. And those membership fees go directly to councils and committees in the UN, like the Council on Human Rights. But anything else they choose to donate is necessary. And they can earmark it for specific agencies or even countries. So if you look at the membership fees for the UN budget, the WFP, the World Food Program, is hopping. And the Department of Peace Operations is huge. So all of these are voluntary donations. But you can imagine if, for example, our former President Trump decided the World Food Program didn't matter to him anymore, or he wasn't going to be a party to the WHO, the model would be severely affected because these are all voluntary donations. All of the membership fees go exactly to the same place. One particularly exciting model of development assistance is the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. I'm going to show you a little animation of how they distribute these funds. So here is how the UN receives its funds, and here will be how the Global Fund distributes its funds as a multilateral organization. I don't know whether you'll be able to hear.
International financing mechanism to help countries save lives by reducing the effects of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria on current and future generations. The Global Fund does not implement programs directly and does not have offices in the countries that receive its financial support. Instead, the Global Fund Secretariat is located in Geneva, Switzerland, and is responsible for day-to-day operations such as raising money, managing proposal applications, monitoring grant performance, and reporting information to the Global Fund Board and the wider public. To ensure that resources are used efficiently and that programs reach the people most in need, the Global Fund relies on local coordinating bodies called Country Coordinating Mechanisms, or CCMs. The CCM is like a committee whose members are responsible for identifying the work that needs to be done, submitting technical proposals to the Global Fund, and overseeing the implementation of the grants. Each country decides who is represented on the CCM. Members could come from all over the country and from many different sectors and backgrounds, each bringing unique experiences and skills to the CCM. This includes technical partners who work in the country to support the programs. The different sectors represented on the CCM could include any relevant ministries from the government, such as the Ministry of Health or Finance, donor organizations, civil society, including charity-based organizations, youth organizations, academia, the private sector, the media, and trade unions. But the Global Fund requires all CCMs to include in its membership people who are affected by AIDS, tuberculosis, and/or malaria to represent the diseases they are fighting.
Stop us there. I think that's by far the most important part of this video. The Global Fund, I am biased, is my dream organization. I would love to work in their policy department, and I've devoted my entire life to doing so. But the idea that they get money from governments, even some private donations, but as a multilateral organization, distribute grants to individual countries, and the beneficiaries are committees, CCMs, of people they choose, including patients suffering from the diseases, and people who work in the private sector and in the government. And what's wonderful about that is that it not only accounts for beneficiary agency, but also makes it more likely that these programs will be sustainable. For example, if you have someone in charge of a vegan food distributor on the CCM, and it's decided that they should be giving vegan food to victims suffering from tuberculosis, after the Global Fund grant ends, that infrastructure will already be set up because the people implementing the grants can build on existing infrastructure. So these are two models of multilateral development, and I think we can learn a lot from the Global Fund's CCM structure.
The Global Fund
How do I
was set up.
get out of this? All right, let's take a look at a case study, Play Pump, a very famous one in the EA movement. This was a non-governmental model of development assistance. So it was just an NGO that anyone could donate to. It was designed in about 2010 and targeted Mozambique. The idea was that you would build a merry-go-round for children, and as they pushed it, they would use the energy from the kids pushing the play pump to pump up water and store it, and then it could be used later. So the children became the pumps. And it was a hit. It was an absolute hit. The US government gave them $10 million. Lauren Bush gave them 16.4. Jay-Z did a benefit concert and got them $60 million somehow. I think that's a wrong number, but amazing in concept. Anyway, people love this idea. As you might expect, though, it was a real disaster. It was an absolute flop. It was horrible. It was called a bunch of terrible things. These are some examples from beneficiaries. No one told them the play pumps were being built over their water sources. It takes 3 months to repair, and no one's going in to prepare it, and they don't trust it anymore. But my favorite point is that the problem, the root cause, was not that they were too lazy to pump the water. It was that there's no water. So you can build as many play pumps as you want, you're not going to solve the problem. And then, of course, you can talk about the fact that you're using child labor to do something, and they clearly underestimated the budget required to maintain these things in incredibly rural areas. So that's kind of funny. You can use it as an insult if someone proposes something. You can say, that's like play pump. Looking instead to a more successful model, we've got PEPFAR. This is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It started in, I believe, 2004. It's bilateral, so the US government gives money to other governments, as well as guidance and monitoring, so technical support and different kinds of other resources. They have very specific targets. Their projects are very long-term. They're very transparent, too. There are all kinds of incredibly detailed reports online. Here's how they spend their money. The majority of the money goes to the treatment of HIV/AIDS, especially through antiretroviral therapy, which is a kind of drug you use to treat it. But they also do a ton of prevention and palliative care for people who are on the verge of death. Super cute. The impacts are impossible to articulate. In addition to saving 17 million lives and making sure that 2.4 million kids aren't born with HIV/AIDS because professionals are able to oversee the birth and make sure that the fluids are, I don't understand it, but preventing 2.4 million other cases, there have been incredible diplomatic, governmental, security-related benefits. All of these have been shown. Feel free to, once I send out the slides, click on these sources. It's incredible what PEPFAR has done. Armed conflict has decreased in countries receiving aid from this program. Rule of law has strengthened, like the courts are better. All measures of trust in governments, government effectiveness, they've been able to develop more. For example, when you have HIV/AIDS in Africa, your chances of getting employment decrease by 13 to 38%, either because of your symptoms or the costs, the time you need to get treatment, or stigma. So if you prevent or treat HIV/AIDS, everyone's going to get employed now, and you empower civil society organizations you're partnering with. But then in terms of reciprocal benefit, what does the US get out of spending all this money? Public opinion increases remarkably. There are all these really sweet reports of kids saying, I pass by this PEPFAR clinic every day on my way to school, and it has an American flag on it, and I'm just so grateful that they're saving the lives of people in my village. Trade increases. They love it. They love you're distributing a lot of resources anyway, so it's better for diplomatic relations. And then finally, I want to point out a term that's kind of emerging now in the last couple of years. It's called strategic health diplomacy. It's the idea that you can get all of these benefits, these strategic benefits, diplomatic benefits, by investing in health. So I'll talk about SHD a little bit later as well. I've been ranting for so long, but this is a wonderful story about a woman receiving PEPFAR support. She says, I was terrified to get this diagnosis, and PEPFAR has just helped me accept it and given me so much support socially, financially. Wonderful video. But I'm going to zip through a little bit. There are a ton of benefits and risks naturally associated with dumping money in a place that may or may not want it, and with or without monitoring. Some of the main benefits, as we've discussed, are increased trade and diplomatic exchange. Globalization is also absolutely wonderful, the ideological exchange that could come with healthier people and closer contact with them. Global security, as we know that decreasing rates of infectious diseases makes them less likely to go to war, which I find insane, will ensure that we're less likely to go to war. Particularly the US as a very nosy military power. We can also make sure that we're guiding them to, which sounds kind of paternalistic, but providing the resources necessary for developing countries to develop green economies. Much of the Western world developed on coal on the backs of enslaved people, but we can make sure that the developing economies of the future use solar panels and have some form of reparations. And finally, it's naturally just a humanitarian thing. On the cons, though, there are plenty. Dependency on aid is really tricky. Again, the idea that if you pull out of a program and they're waiting for you to give them bags of rice, and now there are no more bags of rice, that's going to be really tricky. And so they're going to keep requesting it, and it makes it more difficult to foster domestic infrastructure, trust, authority. There are a bunch of unexpected consequences. There have been wars that have broken out. We don't really know if it works because it's difficult to gauge chain reactions that come from positive interventions. It's tough to, if you don't account for agency, it can be really paternalistic and make everyone question whether you're respecting their sovereignty and independence as a country and a people. And finally, one of the most well-known and widely cited risks of foreign aid is corruption. The idea that if you give money to a country or to an individual, it will disappear, which has been taken advantage of in the last few years, which is very sneaky, and we'll get to that in a minute. But for example, they found that in some of the most aid-dependent countries in the early 2000s, about 15% of World Bank payments disappeared. It happens. It's kind of not preventable, especially if you don't want to be paternalistic and follow every penny, but it is a risk. So onto measuring impact. It's important to acknowledge the kinds of targets and different models of development assistance that you're using. Is it for health? What kinds of impact will that have? Is it multilateral, non-governmental? How will you measure that? Different ways that we could think about measuring the effectiveness of different development programs is the number of people you've reached, or how many vaccines you've distributed. EA just loves quantifying. You could check measures of different development indicators like literacy, some of the ones we saw on the maps earlier. You could look, that's a rogue bullet point. You could look at the duration of engagement. If you come in for 1 month, build a clinic, and leave, that could be a measure of, how impactful your program is probably going to be given its sustainability, the infrastructure they've put in place. And finally, progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals is a really popular way of doing so. Sustainable development goals include zero poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, and it has been used as a measure before. For example, they found that in sub-Saharan Africa, a 1% decrease in HIV/AIDS prevalence would have the same impact on advancing progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a 40% increase in GDP. That was a long quote and it's kind of complicated, but 1% down of HIV/AIDS and 40% increase in GDP would have the same progress, the same improvements towards UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's one way of doing it. Hard to gauge the chain reactions, if educational attainment goes up in this village and you have a nonprofit that builds the schools and a nonprofit across the street gives them books, who's responsible, who gets to take credit, and what can't we measure? Every time you save a life from HIV/AIDS, fewer people will be sad. How do you measure that? Do you take credit for that? All right, is it worth it? Back to the point of this whole presentation. Some key considerations for effective altruists when we're going through this. Is it solvable? Is it big? Is it cost effective? But I hope that we'll also consider whether it's sustainable, whether people are having a say in what's going on, not only because it's just, but also because they know whether something's going to be effective or not. Culturally sensitive, people might ignore it. People might hate merry-go-rounds, but play pump didn't check. I love it. And whether it's tangible, because studies show that people are more likely to have a high public opinion of a donor that gives them something like a bridge or a vaccine than they are to a donor who invests in rule of law programming. They're just, tangibility is important if your goal is strategic health diplomacy. So there are two examples. You can look at them later on the slides. This one was complicated. This is, I believe, Optometrists Giving Sight is the name of this program. Optometry Giving Sight, US, Canada. They have a suspicious budget. They have saved so many people, and they are the only intergovernmental organization targeting people who would go blind if they didn't have an eye exam, and they're doing wonderful things. But they have a massive revenue. Half of it is spent. 37% of their total revenue is going to their programs, and 77% of their spending is going to that program. So if you donated $1, 37 cents, where is the other money going? Who knows? Important for an effective altruist to consider. Their annual reports were super opaque. It was really shockingly easy to navigate and really hard to understand what was going on there. So transparency and accountability are really important when we're evaluating charities, even if they look really good on the surface. Okay, last case study, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So we were thinking about whether OGS was worth it for donors. Probably not, because their money's not going to the program. But is Belt and Road worth it for beneficiaries? Do they accept this aid? Belt and Road Initiative, for those of you who don't know, is a massive $1.2 to $1.3 trillion infrastructure project by 2027, spearheaded by China. If you see this map, they're planning to build ports in all of these places to make sea trade more easy. That is the road part of Belt and Road. And then all of these are going to be bridges, roads, railways, and that is the Belt part of the Belt and Road Initiative name, because there was a problem with the translation. Anyway, 60 countries have already signed up for loans from China to help build these infrastructure pieces. Because of course, why wouldn't you want a port? China's going to give you a lot of money. There are no strings attached. They drop it in the government bank accounts and say, we agree, you should spend this on a port. And so now Sri Lanka has a port and China can go to that port for a discount. Seems mutually beneficial, right? But the payment structure is absolutely insane. They will drop all this money. The interest rates are massive, and they're very careful about what they expect for collateral. As I was saying, you can expect that sometimes in bilateral aid, money will disappear, and the Belt and Road Initiative geniusly takes advantage of that. Because if the money disappears, they will have collateral that they choose. For example, there was some program, I think it was Zimbabwe. They said, if you can't pay back your loan, which is unlikely in many of these cases, we want your national television channel. That's a little strange. Most of the time it's like, we want your mines, we want your airports, and China's getting all of this stuff because they're capitalizing on the ambitions of countries that can't afford these things. So here's a video with different clips of a project in Moldova, I believe, where they wanted to, I just want to wrap up so there's time for questions. They're trying to build a highway, and there's 600,000 people in the whole country, and the government has promised this highway forever, but no one would use it, and it's so expensive. And China hopped in and said, we'll help you pay for it. And the question is, Moldova's GDP is expected to just stay level. So how on earth are they going to pay back? And what have they agreed will be the collateral? A little suspicious. So 60 countries are already on board. I want to leave this. Okay, so now wrapping up. Thank you all so much for your attention. We have a few more minutes until EA Trivia, which I'm very excited for and is on the same platform as the one we used at the beginning of this presentation. And here are some questions for discussion if you don't have any questions about the content of the presentation. Thank you so much.